Today I'm going to take a different look on Easter Sunday, and I'm going to share a parable with you, one that Jesus taught. And so we titled today's message, if you're taking notes, we titled it The Runaway. And we're going to talk about the story of the prodigal son today. If you're like me and you're over 40, you probably at one point in your life either did or thought about maybe running away, maybe going to a friend's house or something. I'll tell you a story. It's a personal story. When I was 11 years old, life was hard, life was difficult. I don't know what was going on, but I was 11 years old, and I figured I'm done with it. I'm going to venture out into the great unknown. I don't remember what it was. I mean, Mom and Dad are here, and we talked a little bit about it this week. I don't remember what it was that put me over the edge. I don't remember what it was, but at 11 years old, I said, life is going to be better on my own. All right, surely I can take care of myself. And I went to the room and I got my backpack and I put some clothes in it. I put a couple of my G.I. Joes in there, and because I don't know why, but they're going to help me out, life on my own. And I quietly went down the stairs because I didn't want anybody to talk me out of this. I'd made up my mind. I was determined. And I got to the door and I quietly opened up the door. Now my heart's racing. My palms are sweaty. Adrenaline is running through. And I step out to the front porch and I quietly shut the door behind me. And then all of a sudden it hit me. I didn't know where to go. So I quietly opened the door and I quietly went back to my room and I quietly shut the door, and I just decided life at home was better. And that's my story of running away from home. And maybe you have a story similar to mine that might be a little funny, but maybe you have a story that's a little bit more tragic and sad. Maybe there's still memories and hurt. Maybe there's still sadness and pain that's there. And so today when I talk to you about the runaway, I don't want to talk about someone who's running away from home. I want to talk to you about someone who's running away from God. Running away from a relationship with the Father. Now, Jesus often told stories when he taught. We call them parables. And Jesus told 3 parables back to back to back in Luke chapter 15, if you want to open your Bibles there. Luke chapter 15, there's 3 parables that Jesus told. First one was about a shepherd who went looking for a lost sheep. The second one was about a woman who went looking for a lost coin. And then immediately following, it's the story, a very well-known story that we call the prodigal son. And it's about a boy who ran away from the father's love. Now, in the story, the father represents God, and the boy who ran away represents you and me, represents us when we abandon, when we turn our backs, when we walk out on the father's love. And so in Luke chapter 15, we'll pick up this story here real quickly in verse 11. And I want you to hear this parable that Jesus teaches about the Father's love. So starting in verse 11, it says, "And he said, there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me.'" Now, apparently the dad had quite a bit of money. And traditionally, when dad died, the money would be distributed between the sons. And in this case, there are 2 sons. And the younger of the 2, and the Bible doesn't tell us his name, so we can just call him Scott. And if your name is Scott today, I apologize. Now, Scott was impatient. And Scott didn't want to wait until his father died. Scott wanted his share of the money now. Now, in the culture of the original listeners, remember when Jesus was telling this, in the culture of those who were hearing it, this was the ultimate insult, a slap to the father's face if a son asked for his inheritance before the father passed away. It was like wishing the dad was dead already. Now, the father couldn't force his son to stay, and the father couldn't force his son to do good and be good and make good choices. So the father divided up the money and he gave Scott his share, and Scott got what he wanted. Scott got his money. That's what Jesus says in the parable in verse 12. "And he, the father, divided the property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had, and he took a journey into a far country." Now, this wasn't vacation, this wasn't sightseeing, this wasn't a gap year in life. Scott was abandoning his father's way of living, everything his father had taught him, everything his father had stood for. Scott had left home and all that home represented. And he went out for life on his own. He ran. Now remember, the father in the story represents God. Scott in the story represents you and me when we run from God. And I've been a pastor for 25 years now, and in that time I've watched teenagers run away from a relationship with God. I've watched young adults and husbands and wives turn their back and run away from God. I've even watched grown adults abandon their faith. And I don't know every reason, and I can't guess to know every reason why somebody would leave, but I can tell you some stories and some reasons that I've come to understand why people have walked out on their faith with God. Some people run because they don't like boundaries or restrictions. They don't want rules that in their mind control them. They want to do things their way, and they don't want to feel the disapproval of others, so might as well not be around disapproving eyes. So they run away from God. Some people run because of the disappointment that they've experienced with people that leads towards anger with God. They respond to the deep hurt that they've experienced leaving God and everyone that's connected to God, and they misplace their anger when they think that mean people represent a mean God. Some people run away because of wrong friendship choices. Oh, how many times have we seen that? Foolish friends convince them that life away from God will be so much more fun. People run because they fear rejection. They mess up. And because they messed up, they don't feel like there's a place for them any longer. And if there's no place for them any longer, they feel the rejection of what watching eyes might think when they walk in the doors. They fear rejection. Some people run away because of addiction. Something else has a hold and control over their life. And so they run away because of addiction. And maybe some people run because they're lonely. It's not so much that they're running from something, they're running towards this elusive something. They imagine that their new life will be so much more fun and filled with happiness. That what they don't have seems to be way better than what they do have. Fantasy trumps reality in their mind. And regardless of the reason why you run, it's sad to watch people turn their back and walk away from their faith in God or abandon the love that God has for them, because you and I, we typically know where it's headed. There's a predictable pattern we can watch in people's lives. Scott ran from his father, and looking at his story, we learn what happens when you run away. When you run away, the consequence of running away is you leave home. Which you're probably saying, well, yeah, Jason, that's the whole point of running away from home, is I want to leave home. But something happens when you leave home, and I want you to understand that because I want to be as honest with you as possible. You see, when you leave home, you also leave the safety of home. When you run from God, you take yourself out from under God's hand of protection on your life. If you don't want God to protect you, you can run. But when you run away, you put yourself out of God's hand of protection on your life. And understand this, it's not that God chooses to stop protecting you, it's that you chose to leave His protection. When you leave home, you also leave the security of home. Now, security is a little different than safety. Security kind of feels that internal emotion of a place where I fit in, a place where I belong. Let me see if I can explain. Some of you might have traveled internationally, and when you go to another country, you're there as a tourist, and you might enjoy it, and you might take some pictures and post some stories on your social media about it, but you don't feel like you quite fit in. You're not a national. You struggle with the language. Maybe you don't like the food at all. Maybe you don't know how to exchange the currency and use their money. And the whole time you're there, you feel like a foreigner, that you don't quite fit in. But something happens when that airplane lands back in America and you're face to face with an immigration officer and you hand him your U.S. passport. They open it up and they stamp it, and as they hand it back to you, they say, "Welcome home." Home. All of a sudden you're reminded of that security that comes in knowing that you belong. See, when you run, you leave away, you leave the safety of home, and you leave the security of home, and also, you leave the blessings of home. I've told my boys many times that there's a blessing that comes with living in the Exley household. For instance, to my boys, when you live in the Exley house, here's some of the blessings you get. Some of the blessings you get is, I pay for your food. And it's a lot of it, right? Here's some of the blessings that come with living in the Exley house. RENEE will do the laundry, and it's a lot of it. Here's some of the blessings that come with living in the Exley house is, you know what? I'll pay for the water and the electricity. I'll put a roof over your head, and you got clothes to wear, gas in your car. Some of the blessings that come with living in the Exley house is RENEE's going to cook for you all your favorite meals, chicken nuggets and chicken strips and mac and cheese. I'm kidding. RENEE's one of the best cooks that I know. She spoils us. You know, I tell my boys often, you're here and you're allowed to watch my TV in my living room, sitting on my couch, breathing my air. Right? It's the blessings of living in the Exley house, but they also know that if they choose to leave home, if they choose to run away, they know the deal. They leave the blessing behind. Blessings don't go with them when they live in disobedience. Now, we would still love them, but we would be fools to let them live their way by their rules and still give them all the blessings of home. You see, when you run away from God, let me say that again. When you run away from God, you run away from His blessings. He wants to bless you, but He won't. He can't. You chose to leave those blessings behind when you turned your back and when you ran away from God. And then last, when you run away from God, you run from the love of the home. Now, don't get me wrong. God still loves you. Let me say it one more time. God still loves you. You're just not there to experience it. I think of a young adult girl who gave her life to Jesus in our student ministry years ago. She came from a very dysfunctional, broken home, and finally, for the first time in her life, she experienced unconditional love. She found a place where she fit in. She found friends. She found love. She found encouragement. She found support. And all of a sudden, at some point in her young adult life, as she went off to college, she found some of those foolish friends we talked about earlier that convinced her life away from God would be so much more fun. Today, her life is a mess. She's broken. It's not that we stopped loving her. It's that she's not here to experience it. And the same thing is true with God. When you run away from your relationship with God, you're not there to experience the love that He has for you. When you leave home, you leave so much behind. You leave the safety, the security, the blessing, and the love of home. Who would want to live like that? And as we continue to look at the story of the prodigal son, there's a pattern that's a pretty recognizable pattern. That even today you might look at it, and if you're early in the stages of turning your back and walking away from a relationship with God, I just want you to be forewarned of what it might look like. Maybe today you've turned back and you've come back to the Father's love, and you're going to hear the pattern today and you're going to say, yeah, that's exactly what happened to me. Or maybe you're in the middle of it right now, 1 foot in with a relationship with God and 1 foot out, and you're like, man, that's what I'm going through right now. And so as Jesus continues to tell the story of the prodigal son, we'll see a pattern that you and I could expect almost every single time. It says in verse 13, not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had, and he took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered it. He squandered his property in reckless living. He squandered his property in reckless living. Scott's dad worked his entire life for that money. Scott didn't invest it. Scott didn't save it. Instead, he squandered it in reckless living. Scott didn't become a missionary to go and help people. He didn't sign up to go join the Peace Corps. He ran a party. And we don't know how long it took him to lose everything, but apparently it didn't take him long to lose everything. And you and I, we can look at Scott today and we can say, well, Scott, that wasn't very smart. No, it wasn't. But again, it's a predictable pattern. When you run away, when you run from God, you make bad decisions. That's the predictable pattern right there. You do things you never thought you would do. You don't plan on making dumb decisions. It's just the consequence of what you do when you run from God. And I've seen it over and over and over in the lives of people who have run from God. When they finally come back, when they come back to church, when we have a moment to pray, when we start to talk about life, where they were, where they are, and where they want to be, they end up saying things to me that are like, why did I ever do that? What in the world made me make that decision? How did I ever come to that point? You see, when you decide to run, you're convinced that life is going to be fun for everyone until it's not. You make bad decisions. It's just what happens when you run. Verse 14 continues and says, and when he had spent everything. You can underline that in your Bible if you want to. He had spent everything. There's nothing left. It's all gone. He lost it all. He lost every single bit of it. And again, that's part of the predictable pattern. When you run from God, you lose. And I've been thinking of people this week who ran from God, and in every single story, there's something common, and the common thread is they all lost. Some lost money, some lost marriages, some lost jobs, some lost businesses, some lost friends, some lost their reputation, and many lost their innocence. When you run from God, you lose. And it's painful to watch. It's painful to watch. I cry over runaways and what their decision cost them when they lost so much. And so Jesus continues this parable in verse 14. It says, when he had spent everything, right, he lost it all. It says a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. He began to be in need. In other words, he was hungry, and he had no money. He lost it all, and he never ever considered that possibility. But all of his plans for fun, all of his plans for friends, every plan that he had made, every plan failed. And that's what happens when you run from God. Your plans fail. You can hear Scott saying, how did this happen? This wasn't part of the plan. And we can be on the outside looking in and say, Scott, how could it not have happened? When you run from God, it's inevitable. Your plans will fail. Your plans for finances or business or relationships or fun or future. When you run from God, your plans fail. One day you'll stand back and you'll look around and you'll say, wait a minute. You know, being pregnant wasn't part of the plan. One day you'll look back and you'll say, wait. Being broke wasn't part of the plan. One day you'll look back and you'll say, being addicted wasn't part of the plan. One day you'll look back and say, being lonely wasn't part of the plan. And that's often where people end up blaming God. And they blame God for all the bad things that are happening in their life right now. But you got to remember, God didn't do this to you. Remember, you're the one who ran from his protection. You're the one who ran from his blessing. You're the one who ran from his love. You see, we teach, and the Bible teaches that blessings follow obedience, but the story also teaches the inverse, that consequences follow disobedience. You see, there's a connection between what's happening in your life right now and what you think about God. Scott was going to be rich and free, he thought, having fun with dad's money. But his plans failed, and he never thought that would happen. And so verse 15 says, he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. Far from the safety, the security, and the blessing of home, Scott got a job in a pig pen. How embarrassing that must have been, because in Scott's mind, he was supposed to be something special. In Scott's mind, he was set apart to be something special. And now instead, he's with the pigs. And again, we see the pattern. When you run from God, you end up embarrassed. And most of the time, that's the biggest hurdle for runaways to overcome. What will people think of me knowing what I've done? Why would people ever let me back in? How can I go home? What will they say? Now, people who are genuine followers of God will truly love you, and they'll rally around you. And so overcome with shame. And verse 16 says, he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate. And no one gave him anything. One, he was willing to eat what the pigs ate. But the problem was no one. No one gave him anything. And when I read those words, no one, I wondered what happened to all the people who helped Scott spend his money. When I read the words no one, I wonder what happened to all the people that Scott partied with. Because what happened to Scott will happen to you. The people who got drunk with you won't detox with you. The people who partied with you are now nowhere to be found. And that's where the feelings of loneliness come in. And maybe this story describes you today. You left your relationship with God. And when you did, you didn't realize the consequences. But now that you realize the consequences, maybe there's alarms that are going off. Maybe there's lights that are flashing. When you've realized the consequences that are there and the predictable pattern you can find yourself and where you're at in there, maybe you find yourself asking a question today, what do I do? What do I do? I don't want to end up alone. I don't want to end up alone, so what do I do? Well, Jesus gives us the answer in the parable, and we can look at what Scott does. Verse 17 says, but when he came to himself. There's another translation that says, when he came to his senses. What brought Scott to his senses? Consequences. What were the consequences? Scott got up and he looked around and he was hungry, he was broke, he was alone, and he was feeding pigs. He'd be foolish not to come to his senses. And I wonder, what would it take for you and me? What would it take for us to come to our senses? How many broken relationships do we need to suffer? How many things do we need to lose in our lives? How many bad decisions do we have to make? How many of our plans need to fail? Why not come home before it gets bad? It's time to come home. When he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread? But I perish here with hunger. I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. You see, Scott made the decision, even if all I do is get a job with dad, it's better than this. I'm going back. I'm going home. I'm going back to the safety, the security, the blessings, the love of home. And that's the message this story tells us today, that no matter how far you've gone and no matter how long it's been, you can always come home. That no matter how far you've gone and no matter how long it's been, you can always come home. You see, it's never too late to come home. No matter what bad decisions you've made, no matter how embarrassed or ashamed you might be, you can always come home. Your biggest fear is, when I come home, what will dad say? When I come home, what will dad do? I love the father in this story in verse 20. It says, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. If you're wondering, what will dad do? That's what God will do. He'll throw his arms around you and he'll say, welcome home. He'll grab you by the shoulders and he'll look at you in the eyes and he'll say, welcome home. Now, before we close today, I want to remind you of another runaway story. And it's one that defines this day, Easter. And it's not of a son running away from a father, but it's about a father running towards his children. You see, that's the whole reason why God sent his son, Jesus, into this world. Easter story is about God's relentless pursuit of us. It's the story of Jesus who willingly left the safety and the security of heaven to come to earth. Jesus who lived a perfect, sinless life. And instead of receiving a crown, he was given a cross. Paul writes in the book of Romans that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Oh, can you picture Jesus? His love, His compassion, His goodness, while we were still sinners, coming running after you. Running after you. Running after you. Jesus suffered, bled, and died, not because He ran away from God, but because we did. We ran away from God, and Jesus, in His love, came running after us. And that's not the end of the story. On the third day, Jesus rose from the grave, conquering death and hell, and proving once and for all that there's no distance too far for the Father's love. You see, Easter is your invitation to stop running. The resurrection is the assurance that you don't have to stay in the pig pen any longer. The empty tomb is a door that's wide open for you to come home. The Father is watching and He's waiting. The cross and the resurrection are His message of love that says, come home. As we close today, let me invite you to stand with me, just right there in your seat. As you stand, would you just bow your head and close your eyes for just a moment?